Hello, welcome. This is a OCR F585 A2 economics video. Now, what we're going to be looking at today is we're going to be looking at something we call comparative and absolute advantage. Well, actually, we're going to be looking at absolute advantage first and then comparing it to, weirdly enough, comparative advantage. Now, they are two they are slightly related. In terms of they are both about advantages, but the way we look at them are very different. And you can have a country which has a comparative advantage over a country that... so a country can have a comparative advantage but cannot have its possibility of not having an absolute advantage. I will come on to why that is in a little bit, but for the moment, just like to introduce you to these two situations. Now, the reason I've done this is purely so you actually remember the video. Okay, so the country has is UK and Kenya, and okay, so the countries have now just decided out of the blue that they can either survive of producing two things or trading two goods or services. On the one hand, we've got Donald Trump flags, and on the other hand, we've got the bank services that Donald Trump uses. I mean, these are only small loans of $1 million, but they used. So basically, one country is going to produce the flags for Donald Trump to run his campaign, and the other country might decide to lend him $1 million in the bank services. Okay, so the two situations we've got here. Now, this shows the PPC, now the possibility curve. Now, you may be looking at that going, oh, what the hell? Surely, from F581, we know the possibility curve looks something like that, where it's more of a circular thing. And that's kind of correct, but really, just for simplicity, I've drawn it like that. You can draw it as a curve if you want to, but really, kind of looks something like that. Alright, so, how do we relate these to absolute and comparative advantage? Well, obviously, I'm going to start with absolute advantage. Now, the definition of... So, by the way, actually, just probably should, before I start going through comparative and absolute advantage, is I should mention that we are assuming that these two countries, so the UK and Kenya, have exactly the same amount of factors of production. So they're exactly the same square meters of land. They have exactly the same amount of labour, capital and enterprise, and obviously that's not the case. If you don't get why we've just assumed that, then as I said, it doesn't really matter because they won't ever ask you about this, but it's just something to get your head around. Now, we can either think of it like they've got the same production, but if you're sat there going, how can we just assume that? I'll explain in a bit more depth. Now, the reason you can almost think of this as per square metre or per a few thousand miles. Each country can produce 10 Donald Trump flags or 10 bank services. So each little bit of land, okay, of the UK can produce 10 Donald Trump flags or 10 bank services, and every same amount of land for part of Kenya, they can either produce 4 Donald Trump flags or 8 bank services, okay? So you could either look at it as I said, basically they've got the same amount of land, so either way you think of that, as I've just explained it there, doesn't matter. So just imagine they've got the same, the key thing with this is they've got the same amount of factors of production, okay, for each country, even though they produce different amounts of different things. Now, it doesn't mean they produce 10 Donald Trump flags and 10 bank services, it just says if they devoted all of their production capacity to Donald Trump flags, they would be able to produce 10, the UK. And if Kenya devoted all of their resources to produce Donald Trump flags, they would only be able to produce 4. And if the UK wanted just to produce bank services, they would produce 10 bank services. Now, you can think of that as 10,000, 10 million, just 10, okay? And if Kenya devoted all their factors of production to producing bank services, they would only be able to produce 8 or 8/10. Yeah, so they would only produce 8 of what the UK can produce. 8 compared to the UK's 10. Okay, so we're going to look at, as I said, absolute and comparative advantage. Now that's all cleared up, we can go on to actually what we're meant to be learning. Okay, so what are the differences? Well, we'll start with absolute advantage. Now, absolute advantage obviously assumes that both countries have the same factor of production, etc., as we've mentioned. But the key thing with this is which country is more efficient at producing. Now, mainly when we say comparative absolute advantage, you might have absolute advantage in Donald Trump flags or absolute advantage in bank services or one of the goods. But let's just assume both countries have just wanted to produce Donald Trump flags because they want to be invaded and or shot at the first sight. Okay, so right, so as I say, if they're both producing Donald Trump flags, then the UK will be producing 10 and Kenya will be producing 4. Now, as I said, if we assume they have the same amount of resources, the same number of people, not necessarily the same people, but the same number of people, and you know the same sort of weather or whatever it might be, okay. Or actually not weather, forget that. Yeah, so if they have the same amount of factor of production, the UK can produce 10 and Kenya can produce 4. Now clearly the UK can produce more from the same amount of resources, therefore they're more efficient, so therefore their unit costs are lower per Donald Trump flags, so therefore they can sell it at a lower price, hence being more internationally competitive. Now the key thing with all this is that they have an absolute advantage in Donald Trump flags because they can produce more with the same amount of resources, so surely they're better at it, hence they have an advantage. An absolute advantage, and the key thing with an absolute advantage is it's cheaper per unit cost. So it's cheaper for the UK to produce a Donald Trump flag than it is for Kenya to produce a Donald Trump flag. Similarly, if we look at the bank services, then UK can produce 10 and Kenya can only produce 8 if both countries just switch to producing bank services. Okay, so therefore, if we look at this, then obviously UK can produce more from the same amount of resources, hence it's more efficient. And the same principle applies. Now, it's not always the same like this, where one country can produce more of one thing and more of the other compared to another country. This is just in this situation. So UK might have only been produced 6 Donald Trump flags and Kenya might have been able to produce 12. As I said, this is just an example of a scenario. Okay? Apart from no one would ever want to produce Donald Trump flags, you know, that's just a thing. But anyway, right. Now the key thing with that is the absolute advantage, at least for the UK, is both in terms of bank services and in terms of Donald Trump flags. Now, let's just imagine this for a second. Okay, what I was just mentioning at the start of this video is one country can have an absolute advantage, but it might not necessarily have a comparative advantage, and the other way around. Okay, and vice versa. So what the hell? How the hell can the... So just for this, I'm just going to give you a heads up. Kenya's got the comparative advantage. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but you may be looking at that going, what the hell? You've just said the UK has an advantage in producing Donald Trump flags and in producing bank services. And unless we fling out some kind of magic number from somewhere that says Kenya's population has all been shot, which is quite likely, and there's one person left producing, they can produce the same thing, then there's no way that we can say Kenya has some kind of advantage over the UK. Well, to be able to understand this, we need to be able to recap what we talked about way back in F585 about opportunity cost. Now, just to give you a bit of a refresh, opportunity cost is one of them definitions that you did in F585 where it was just one sentence, and that sentence was, it's the cost of the next best alternative foregone. So how do we apply that idea to this, and how do we link it into this idea that we're going to talk about as comparative advantage? Well, so let's just recap. As I said, opportunity cost is the cost of the next best alternative foregone. And now the only alternative for both of these is to produce something over the other. So in this case, it might be producing bank services over producing Donald Trump flags, or producing Donald Trump flags as over bank services. And now what I mean by that is, let's look at if we wanted to produce more of something than the other. So, and really this is all about ratios. So let's have a look at the ratio straight away, okay? So the way you start this is by doing a ratio of the maximum Donald Trump flags to the maximum bank services. So 10 Donald Trump flags, so I just put DTF is equal to 10 bank services. So the UK can either produce 10 Donald Trump flags or 10 bank services. Kenya can either produce 4 Donald Trump flags, DTF, or 8 bank services, 8BS. Okay. Now, we said the opportunity cost is the opportunity cost of the next best alternative foregone. So what we need to do, the way to put in perspective of this kind of analogy is, if we wanted to produce more of one good, what we have to give up of the other, hence the next best alternative foregone. Because if we produce more of one good, we could have used that energy to produce the other good. Hence we could have produced one more Donald Trump flag, but what would we have had to forgo to be able to produce that? So how much of the bank services, or how many bank services would we have had to forego to be able to produce that extra Donald Trump flag? Okay, so you could either look at it in terms of, that what we said there about Donald Trump flags and what we'd have to give up bank services. So let's look at that. Okay, so therefore what you'd do is you'd get it down to 1 Donald Trump flag, and then you'd go, okay, well, what's that equal to in terms of bank services? Okay, well, obviously in the UK, 1 Donald Trump flag equals 1 bank service. No, the ratio is 1 to 1. However, if we wanted to produce 1 more of the Donald Trump flags in Kenya, so 1 DTF, then we would have to forego 2 bank services. Okay, so clearly, if we wanted to produce 1 more Donald Trump flag, the UK would be more efficient. Okay, because in Kenya, if we wanted to produce 1 more Donald Trump flag, then we would have to forego 2 bank services, because we can produce twice as many bank services as we can Donald Trump flags. Now let's look at it from the other perspective. Let's look at it from if we wanted to produce 1 extra bank service. Now, because this is a 1-to-1, what I mean by that is, to produce 1 more bank service, we'd have to forego 1 Donald Trump flag, or if we wanted to produce 1 Donald Trump flag, we'd have to forego 1 bank service. But in Kenya, to increase the production of the Donald Trump flags by 1, you would have to forego 2 bank services. Okay, but if what we want to do is we want to now know, okay, well, what is, if we wanted to produce 1 more bank service, then what would you have to go in terms of Donald Trump flags? Well, if we wanted to produce 2 bank services, more bank services, we'd have to forgo 1 Donald Trump flag. So therefore, to produce 1 bank service, we would have to go half a Donald Trump flag. So you could just, chop off the top half of his head. Okay, so 1 Donald Trump flag on the flag, obviously. So to increase your bank services by 1, you'd have to forgo 1 Donald Trump flag. Okay, so that's really. So therefore, what can we make of all this? Okay, so Kenya before said absolutely no way it can have an advantage in anything at all. But when we looked at it a bit more closely, yes, the UK had an absolute advantage because it can produce more Donald Trump flags and more bank services if production was devoted to 1 of the 2. Okay, but then we looked at a comparative advantage and we said, okay, well, a comparative advantage is about opportunity cost, and to understand that we have to look at ratio. Okay, now we did say, okay, well, the UK does have a comparative advantage, but that's only in when we want to produce 1 more Donald Trump flag, we have to forgo 1 bank service. But in Kenya, we have to produce 1 more Donald Trump flag, we have to forgo twice as many bank services. Okay, so therefore, if we wanted to increase Donald Trump flags, then it'd be more efficient to do it in the UK. But if we wanted to, so therefore the UK has a absolute advantage and the comparative advantage in producing Donald Trump flags. Okay, but if the Kenya wanted to produce, if Kenya wanted to produce 1 more bank service, they would only have to forgo half a Donald Trump flag, because they can only produce a maximum of 4 anyway, so they're not giving that up that much more. Okay, so if we were to look at now, when countries trade, they don't go off absolute advantage, they go off comparative advantage, because obviously comparative advantage looks at costs, so it's which is more efficient kind of thing. Okay, so if we were to actually do this in terms of trade, then the UK would be tasked with producing Donald Trump flags because it has a comparative advantage in Donald Trump flags, and Kenya would produce bank services because it is more efficient at producing bank services. Even though the UK could produce more if it switched it all to that, but because it can produce even more Donald Trump flags because the ratio is better in the UK, then the UK would be tasked with doing Donald Trump flags, producing them, and Kenya would produce bank services. Okay? Alright, so hopefully that makes some kind of sense. Now really that's all I wanted to discuss really for this video. I do apologise about the crude axes of what the UK might produce. I probably should put America in there instead of Kenya, but don't want to offend too many people. Not that bothers me because no one watches it anyway, so I could have put anything on there, but I just chose to keep it quite conserved. Should have done the general election. Might do that next time. But if you would prefer me to do that, just to keep it interesting, please do let me know. But anyway, thanks for watching. Hope I haven't shot you too much, and we'll see you in the next video. We're just going to look at trade.